All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Process of Publishing webinar put on by SciChi. I'm Kelly Kukalo. I'm a graduate student at the University of North Dakota, and I have the privilege today of introducing my co-host for this webinar, who will be happy to tell you more about how to go about publishing your research. So first, we have Shannon McGilvey from Weber State University, where she is an associate professor. We also have some journal editors joining us. We have Matthew Rhodes from Colorado State University, and he is the associate editor of Perspectives on Psychological Science and Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory, and Cognition. And then we also have Debbie Brannon joining us from Western Oregon University, and she is the editor of SciChi Journal. For those of you in the audience, if you have any questions during our webinar, I'm going to ask you to pop them in the little chat window, and we'll be consciously monitoring that throughout the webinar, and we will kind of read your question aloud so everybody else can see it, and then we will address it there. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So just really quickly going through our topics for today. Shannon, do you want to go ahead and take it away?
Yeah, sure. Welcome. I know most of you who are joining are probably interested in this idea of maybe publishing your senior thesis or something when it's completed. So the purpose of this talk is to kind of give you some good practical advice and things to be conscious of as you're sort of considering this process, the publication of your thesis. So we'll talk about how you kind of convert a thesis into more of a manuscript format, and what the process also looks like from the editorial side. So once you submit it, what's happening and how to deal with revisions.
Okay.
So from your thesis to the manuscript, so the good news is this is definitely something that can happen. It's a process that many have successfully completed. So the real news is it actually will work. So let's say you've completed your senior thesis and maybe you have some really interesting looking data you're excited about, your advisor is maybe excited about. So the first thing you want to do is really discuss with your advisor whether or not he or she feels like, could we take this to a publication level? So, and, ask their honest opinion. So sometimes studies may have methodological flaws or some other issues that need to be ironed out. So keep in mind, while the general idea that was driving your senior thesis, maybe you may actually end up needing to modify some things, potentially changing a few things, running additional subjects, or sometimes even running a second or third study to sort of better clarify your general findings and rule out potential other possible factors that could have influenced your results. So yes, it is a process that will take a little while, but if you're in for it, if you're up for it, then just hang in there and keep going. All right. So what are you gonna need to change in your thesis? Bad news is a lot. So what a thesis looks like versus a manuscript you submit for publication, there's going to be a lot that and it's something that always happens. So like my master's thesis, my dissertation, I published and they were very different once they reach their publication stage. So getting into it, I know it's challenging because you probably spent a lot of time and effort working on this paper, but there definitely will have to be some changes that need to be made. And so coming into it, just know that it's going to be a rewrite, and that's okay. So one of the big things is in a thesis, you probably really thoroughly go through everything. Maybe your advisor wanted at least 20 pages or more. But keep in mind, for publication, you really need to be concise and really hone in on the most sort of relevant findings. So in starting with the introduction, there may be studies that you found that aren't really necessarily too closely related to what you were doing. So you either need to very much pare down the content of those in the introduction, or maybe even remove them. It might involve even going back to the literature and looking for some other things. So an introduction in a paper is often maybe 6 pages for a full page manuscript. So you really need to get to the point fast. In the first paragraph or two, your reader should really have a good idea of what you're doing and starting to realize, why is this important to look at? So getting to the point quickly, not waiting till the end of the introduction is important. And then also making sure that you explicitly really clarify the purpose of this paper and how it helps understand some phenomenon from a theoretical perspective, or practical implications of your findings. Okay, so the introduction is probably going to be the section that will have the most edits. So spend a fair amount of time there, work with your advisor, but there probably also need to be some changes to the other sections. So the method section. I realized for a thesis, probably the only person who's read it or will read it will be your advisor and your thesis committee. And they already kind of know what you're doing, right? You've already talked about this project with them. They're very familiar with it. So sometimes when you're writing and you know, for a person who knows the study, but if you're going to turn it into a manuscript, you need to be aware that people that you're submitting it to know nothing, zero about what you've done. So you very much need to be clear in your methodology, giving examples of materials, but still maintaining that sort of clear and concise goal. So this may, paraphrase the key instructions or whatnot to participants. Make sure you include information about timing or modality that participants responded in, and any sort of information like that. So while you want to be thorough in your method, so somebody who wasn't part of the study understands it, make sure you're getting to the point quickly there as well. As far as the results section, now it's likely also that you ran a lot of results for your thesis, pretty much everything you maybe could. All of those might not necessarily be included in a manuscript you submit for publication. So Kelly will talk a little bit more about this shortly, but one thing to do is sort of look at other papers on similar topics, how they're reporting analyses. But keep in mind, like, you might need to rerun things, maybe run new analyses, maybe cut some of the other sort of less central key analyses from your thesis manuscript. So again, that section will probably need edits. And again, you'll probably also want to tweak the discussion a little bit. Again, sort of tightening it up, making sure it's very clear how your findings relate to and sort of fit in with this larger body of literature, and then what they suggest. So my last point I have there is temper your conclusions. And as a young researcher, I know you get really excited when you do something and you want to make a big deal out of it, which is good. But in research, remember, it's always really important to try to be cautious in how you interpret your results. So I always suggest, try to suggest people use words like, these findings suggest that, or these findings may indicate, because unless you've really done additional studies that have ruled out alternate explanations, you want to make sure that you're not making claims that you can't back up. So throughout your manuscript, you want to look at the wording you're using to make sure that that wording is consistent with what you actually found, right? So some of our other speakers will talk about the editorial side, but as somebody who's reviewed the discussion, some of the claims seem like they're extending past what the results have shown. That's often a problematic sort of point and something that needs to be addressed. So just proceed with a level of humility in terms of your writing. Research is a process, and any one or two studies is not a definitive say on a topic. So those would be some of my big suggestions. Just some things to keep in mind as you're considering converting your thesis to a manuscript.
So
just a few other considerations. Oh, or Kelly,
oh no, go
hop
for
in
it.
here.
No.
So other considerations are also what type of study do you have? Is it more of a replication study? Is it a manuscript? And also, will it be a brief report or a full-length manuscript? So brief reports, not all journals have them, but some journals have a specific section for brief reports, which are typically just a single study. They do have a pretty strict word limit. So in terms of cutting down your thesis, a lot more will need to be done there. A full-length manuscript that actually usually does involve a number of studies. So this is what I was talking about earlier. You may need to run some follow-ups. Another thing to consider, a lot of journals also want a power analysis. So power analysis tell you, did you have the ability to detect an effect, assuming there is one? So there's various tools you can do to run a power analysis to make sure you had sufficient to find out what's going on. And as I mentioned before, again, looking at your analyses, you definitely do want to consider prior literature and other studies and see what sort of analyses are typically done for your type of design, for your type of data. I'm going to hand it over to Kelly. She's going to tell you a little bit more.
Yeah, so as you get more into the preparation, you've started to really take a look at your thesis and are really starting to get serious about preparing it to submit for publication in a journal. There are a few things that I like to do and that my advisor has had me do, which I feel have actually been very helpful. The first thing that I tend to do is look at journal articles on similar topics or that are in your field of study. And I really try and focus on the structure of those articles and focus of those articles and really take a look at the formatting, because this does a few things. One, it can like inspire my flow, so I know kind of what the hot topics are in terms of this particular area that I'm interested in. And then it can also point out some maybe newer literature that I haven't had the chance to take a look at. So I make sure I'm well informed, and like Shannon said, kind of knowing where my boundaries are in terms of discussing my results and also placing them in the context of what's going on in the field, how it matches up or how it doesn't. The second bullet point, seeking feedback, I think is probably one of the scariest things that you do as a student. And it took me a really long time to be okay with sharing my writing with other people. But I think something that you have to keep in mind is that your advisor, your peers, other professors are really interested in helping you be the best writer that you can be and helping the manuscript be the best manuscript that it can be. So while the feedback, right, when my advisor still writes in red pen, prints out my manuscript and uses red pen. So while you can see that red pen and kind of go into panic mode, know that every piece of criticism and feedback is really geared towards making you better. And so when you kind of reframe it like that, it's a little bit easier to do and make those changes. And while it can seem like a tedious process, you probably learn the most from getting feedback from other people in terms of developing your own writing style. And this will really help you feel prepared for getting reviewer comments. because when you get practice at, addressing that feedback you get from people you kind of are in the mode, in the zone to then address feedback from people you don't. The other thing that I think is really helpful as you're getting really serious about submitting a manuscript is to play reviewer yourself. This is probably the assignment that I've had in grad school that has been most beneficial for my writing. My advisor and I will pick out a few key articles or relevant articles that are published that are related to the study that we're doing or the manuscript we're about to submit. And we'll both kind of pretend that we are the editor or a reviewer for that journal, and we go through the article together and talk about any comments, concerns, things that we liked, things that we didn't like, things that we felt like we could have been better, things that should have been addressed. And then we look at our own manuscript and try and map those comments and concerns onto our manuscript. So maybe, this manuscript didn't account for BMI differences between the groups. I do a lot of dieting research. So maybe that's something we want to do, because as a reviewer looking at these other manuscripts, that's something that I would have wanted to see. So doing that with somebody else can be very helpful. The last little bullet point I have here are some other resources. APA's Style Blog has a cute, good little blog article about publishing your dissertation or your thesis. So if you're looking for more information, that might be a good other external source to take a look at. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Debbie to talk about preparing to submit.
So preparing to submit is a nerve-wracking thing, and you guys covered so much stuff that I won't reiterate, but you need to listen to all of this, because then it comes to someone like me to look at. And first of all, when you have a manuscript, you really have to do a lot of communication between you and your advisor, your colleagues in your research lab. I remember my very first paper, I submitted it to this really high impact factor journal, and it was up there, and of course it was rejected. But the great part is that with that rejection, I got a lot of really good feedback, so that helped me make the paper into what I wanted. We at the PsyChi Journal get a lot of papers from junior faculty, graduate students, undergraduate students, and we hold everyone to a certain standard, which is on our website. The fun part about our journal is that unlike any other journal that I know of, so it goes through a quality control, and we're going to talk about this more in a minute, but it comes to me and then goes to many reviewers to look at. So you get a lot of support along the way, because the first time you're submitting, and the second and the third and the fourth, it's a clunky process, and people make mistakes along the way. And we come into this as PsyChi saying people are going to make mistakes, so we're going to help you out. So our aim and our scope of our journal is to be inclusive. We have special issues. We have one that just came out on diversity. We have a motto where we want to support that, and so we really highly recommend people obviously submitting to us. But sometimes your papers, and especially like theses, they can be so amazing that it's worth trying a couple of those high-level journals. But you got to just make sure that it's a good fit. Our journal, unlike most journals, is we accept any type of paper, so it can be qualitative or quantitative. It can be with children or adults. It can be, any kind of field: experimental, applied, social, cognitive, clinical. Those are our big areas. So you can submit, but you want to make sure that you find a journal that's a good fit for you. So preparing to submit your manuscript. Okay, my biggest piece of advice is don't think that just because it was a good research methods paper that it's going to be a good manuscript. I hate to break that to you, but let me tell you, in case someone else doesn't. You got an A on that paper, but it is paper for a class is different than a manuscript, and that's why I really highly recommend getting the new APA manual. There's a whole section in there that will help you on kind of making that transition, what we expect in a journal. The formatting needs to be accurate. If we get a paper in, our quality control person will boot it right back out if it's not APA. And we're doing the new APA, so it's a little different. It's not real hard to learn. But when I get a paper, I will do a desk projection if it looks like and reads like a class paper. So make sure that you're doing the correct formatting. That to me is like number one, that you went through that effort to make it like that.
Hi, so this has actually been great stuff, and I love all this. And so you might have noticed one of the things Kelly said was, as part of preparing your manuscript, you want to take this reviewer perspective. And so something Debbie and I want to help you with is to give you the editor perspective and how the editor sees the world. And so Debbie talked about some of the quality control that goes on at the Saikai Journal, and that's very similar to just about any other journal you're going to run into. And so we thought we would just give you a sense of how the process works. And the first step is you go to these websites. Actually can be confusing, to be honest, with my own students. The first time they submit, I don't know if anybody else does, I usually sit down with them and help them submit their first paper, because the sites are actually asking for quite a bit. Yeah. So you'll submit this paper. There's usually an editorial assistant or managing editor who will look over your manuscript. They're not looking at content. They're really looking at a lot of the things Debbie was talking about. They're looking at formatting, and did you include everything the journal requires? Did you check all the boxes? So they're making sure all of that is in place. So once the editorial assistant clears the paper, and by the way, if they see things that aren't in place, they're going to push it back to you, and they're going to ask you to resubmit. I once had one of my students once did this 5 times for one's manuscript. Like every time we adjusted one thing, the editorial assistant came back with something else we needed to do. So they're going to keep pushing it back to you. So once finally it's cleared, a typical journal, the paper will now go into the queue for the editor. And the editor will now take a look at the manuscript and decide whether to pass it on. And journals differ. So some journals, as an example, would be Psychological Science, actually has an editor and then an associate editor with expertise in that area take a look at the paper and decide whether it's going to be passed on. So what do we mean by passed on?
I will take that part. Do you want me to? I have a little bit to add to this, if you don't mind. One thing I can say as an editor, once I get the paper and I look at the content, but probably the number one thing that's always missing from papers, not always, often missing, are reliability coefficients. So I'm not going to take a paper if I don't see that reliability coefficient in there, period. That's a desk rejection immediately. Sometimes if the papers are really good, I might switch it back to the managing editor and say, hey, let's tell the authors, put this in and let's pull it back into our queue. And then when I get it, I do the same thing. I send it to, as Matt mentioned, I send it right to an associate editor that's an expert in that field. And then in our journal, we send it out to 3 different reviewers. So you have 3 reviewers, you have an associate editor, and me all looking at your paper. So, and we go into this with the goal of trying to help people through the process, which with some of my rejections that I've gotten in my life, I didn't feel like they were trying to help me through the process a lot, which that can happen. So you just be prepared. Okay, Kelly.
All right, next slide. Here you go.
So you heard Debbie talk about elements they think about at the Saikai Journal, and so I'll try to talk generally about how a lot of journals operate. So the editor has gotten your paper and they're figuring out what to do with it. And what the editor is really asking himself or herself is, does this paper have a chance? Like, they're not asking, is this a slam dunk? They're just saying, does this paper have a chance to make it into the journal? If they think it has a chance, they're going to pass it on to the next stage where they're going to put it usually in the queue of an associate editor, and we'll talk about that in a second. They're going to assign reviewers. But they will also frequently, and it depends on the journal, there are also a number of cases where they'll go ahead and engage in what's called a desk reject. Or if you ever talk to an editor and say, hey, what is your triage policy or triage rate? What you're really asking is, how do you make decisions about what you're going to reject up front before you even send it to reviewers. So this is really our perspective on what we see as the top 3 reasons a paper might be rejected. So the first one would be it's not a bad paper, so they're not commenting on your skills or anything like that, but it's just not a good fit for this particular journal. So we put up some advice earlier about how you might establish that. So look at so the papers you're referencing, where are they tend to be published? Most journals, pretty much all journals, will publish or put something out there saying, here are the aims and scope of the journal. So as an example, I, for example, review for a lot of journals that are concerned purely with cognition. So how can we think about how memory and decision-making work? And so those journals are really interested in that. If you did work with children and sent it to a cognitive journal, the editor is going to ask, this looks interesting, they're working with children, but is this going to tell us something about cognition? And so in that case, if they don't think it's telling us something about cognition in general, you might get a desk reject with advice that perhaps you might go to a journal with developmental interests. So fit is one element. Editors will also look over a paper, and if they believe from their own perusal of the paper that it's just not up to the quality standard of the journal, they'll reject the paper on the spot. And the quality sort of differs. It's very much an eye of the beholder sort of thing. So I wish I could give you more concrete details on that, but they're looking, it depends on the journal. So is this paper making a significant theoretical contribution? Were the experiments, was the study well executed? Is the paper well written? And as another example, I think it's worthy of having this as its own bullet point. So I don't know if you heard earlier, there is now much more of an emphasis on power analyses. And I can tell you from a lot of journals, editors are now highly sensitive to sample size. So for example, if you have a really complicated, I've seen this experimental design where you have, say, 4 variables, and those analyses require a lot of power, and you have 25 subjects, you are probably going to have a desk reject right there. So editors are very keen on sample size, and those are, at least, I think there are other perspectives, but to us, those are sort of the 3 main things we see as driving desk rejects.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback off that, I want to comment on the poor fit criteria for, reason number 1 to decline a paper. I've reached out to editors before. If you read an aim and scope of a journal and you kind of not sure if it fits what you did in your study, or you're feeling kind of, uneasy about maybe submitting, I've reached out to editors before and asked them, like, would this be something that you are interested in? And I would say every time I've gotten a positive response where they're happy to hear about the paper and then give you an honest answer. Some editors have told me, yes, this is appropriate. Some editors have told me, suggested reframes that would make the paper more appropriate for that journal, and other times I've gotten, this is not something we would be interested in. And I think it feels nerve-wracking as a student to reach out, but again, I don't know, Matt and Debbie, if you have opinions, but you don't want to waste your time reading something that's not relevant. So I feel like it's nice to reach out if you really are unsure.
I totally agree with that. I don't mind ever getting papers from people. And I will say the power analysis is a big one for me. People will often say, do I have enough people in my study to submit it to you? And my comeback is, do a power analysis and then we'll know. So,
yeah.
But I don't mind. I would rather catch things early on,
Yep.
and then it will be better, or maybe it just doesn't fit for our journal. But I appreciate it when people, reach out and through the whole process. That's my job. I don't mind it at all.
Absolutely. And we find it exciting. So we want good papers to come in. It's exciting to read good work, and we're happy to encourage authors to provide that kind of advice. So I agree with everything that's going to be said. You're not going to get a hostile reception asking that question. People are actually going to be pretty friendly, and I think have good advice for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So as I said, trilogy rates vary by journal. So at the very top, so you might have heard Debbie talking about she started out when she was first doing this, a really high impact journals. What she's meant by that, sort of the best journals out there that in many ways the best journals are publishing the best stuff, and the other side of that is often it means they're rejecting the most paper. So it varies by journal. So the very elite journals. So for example, if you think your work can go into Science or Nature, they have a very high bar. And they're essentially, I think, cutting out about 90% of what comes in. So that's a pretty extreme, psych journals don't operate that way, fortunately. That's pretty extreme. So it varies by the journal and by editorial policy. One of my favorite editors I've worked with said his perspective was, again, I want papers that have a chance. And I lean in the direction, if I think there's any possibility it has a chance, I actually like to push it on. And I've run into other editors who have this perspective, if I have any doubt, I prefer to reject it. And so it's going to be based on the individual editor right there. And my own perspective is, if you truly don't think the paper is going to fly here, and you know that up front, go ahead and reject it. Like, let me move on in the process. It's not going to be worth my time if you know it's not going to get in to wait 3 months for reviews or something like that. And so one of my grad students has an interesting story. She had run what we thought was excellent work. We submitted it to one of the better journals in cognition. We thought it was great work. And like a day or two later, we had the editor essentially telling us, this was a nice study, but there's no way it's going to get into this journal. And so I remember my student wasn't happy about it, but my message to her was, it's better to hear that now. That's truly what the editor believes in months from now. And so the editor provided us some actually pretty good feedback. We integrated that feedback into the manuscript. We sent it on to another journal. It was immediately sent out for review, and that paper got in with what we would call, we'll explain this in a bit, with minor revisions. So it was desk rejected at a big journal, and then another really good journal seemed to like the paper, and the paper got in. So it's okay to get these desk rejects. That's going to be our message throughout. Take a constructive view of the feedback. So I'm going to take that feedback. I'm not going to think about it in an emotional way. I'm going to take that feedback. How can I make my paper better? And I'm going to move on to the next outline.
Feedback to me is like just a tool belt. You're filling up your tool belt with knowledge. And if you look at it like feedback means they care enough to tell you something. Because, if I didn't care, I would be like, you're rejected. I'm not going to tell you anything about it. So look at it like they care enough. And like working on dissertations, Kelly, that they care enough.
So much feedback. Dissertation life is all consuming right now, so I relate to the feedback message.
So what's going to happen if your paper, so let's say the paper has gone on, typically most journals, so I think we're making assumptions. So the journals are typically staffed this way. There is an editor who oversees all the journal operations. Underneath the editor is a set of associate editors who handle manuscripts, solicit reviews, make decisions. And then under them are a set of consulting editors. And these are people, you'll see them on the cover of journals if anybody looks at covers anymore. But these are essentially individuals who have agreed, like, what happens when you're a consulting editor is you're saying, if you send me a paper, I'm pretty much going to say yes every time you ask me to review this. So the editor, if they send it on to the associate editor, that individual will solicit reviews. Journals differ. They'll usually go for 2 to 5 reviews. I'm typically seeking 3. It's actually very difficult to track down reviewers. So my record on a paper was I had to make 16 requests to get 3 reviews. So it really helps, especially if this is my area. A lot of journals will actually say, can you suggest reviewers? Please suggest reviewers. It's hard to know what to do. I'm not going to go with all of your picks, but I do my darndest to make sure at least one of those reviewers is somebody you suggested. And some journals, by the way, will even tell you who not to suggest, like who that you don't want as a reviewer. I don't think that's something you need to worry about right now. So suggest reviewers is the option. And then at that point, you've gone through all this work on your manuscript, got it submitted, it's made its way through, and now it's really just waiting. I think Debbie can add on to that, but you're just waiting at this point.
And that is such a hard process. But we do the same thing. I have to admit, we're really kind of spoiled at the Psychi Journal because we have a lot of reviewers. We rarely, around the holidays and like the end of the academic year, it's kind of hard to find people. But day in and day out, we have an abundance of reviewers. People get really excited because they remember when they were the young Psychi member. We're all Psychi members, and they just like being a part of it. So I have to admit, I'm a little spoiled. Our process is probably a lot faster than most journals because we just tell our reviewers, listen, you got this much time. But you usually can get your first draft back within 10 to 12 weeks. That's our average. So, but don't look at this. This is like not the normal journal. But for us, that's what we're able to do.
All right. So like Matt and Debbie were saying, you often kind of have a significant waiting period between when you submit and then when you hear back about the decision that's being made on your manuscript. So often this requires a lot of patience. And one thing that's really helpful for me is timing out my other projects or other research interests appropriately so I can keep busy. So it really, in order to assist with this waiting game, I think it's really good to have other ongoing projects that are at different stages of completion. So what I mean by that is after you submit one manuscript and you're waiting to hear back, this might be the ideal time to start, designing another study or analyzing data for another project in which data collection is complete. For me, having other stuff to do alleviates some anxiety about waiting to hear back, but it also allows you to continue being productive in that research context and just kind of doesn't overwhelm you with doing, oh my God, I have 4 different projects and I have to do the stats on all of them. It kind of gives your brain a break to break up the monotony of doing one thing and work on different projects.
One thing I would add to this too is be prepared for the reviewers to be very blunt. Mm-hmm. Their job is not to sit there and go, oh, this is nice and your table looks pretty. Their job is to say, fix this, fix this, fix this. So it feels, I think, and the others can say what they think, but it feels harsh. But when you go through it, you change your mindset, like you talked about earlier, Kelly, is that just, you got to know that they're helping you, but just be prepared. It's just, it seems overwhelming at first, but just read through it, walk away, then talk to your faculty advisor.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually something that I've started doing is I won't look at feedback alone. I will sit there with my advisor or whoever my co-author is. So that way, like, you have somebody to bounce ideas off of kind of right from the get-go and say, that's okay, we can handle this. And sometimes it's nice to just have that extra support, but it feels personal, but it like Debbie said, it's really for the improvement of the paper. All right. So after you're done waiting,
what's going to happen? Yeah, when those reviews finally, and actually, I love what they were saying. So the reviews can feel blunt. They can feel harsh. I remember one of my grad students had what I saw as a relatively light set of reviews. They looked pretty friendly to me, and she was aghast at what people were saying. So it takes a bit to get used to this process. Mm-hmm. Our rule in my lab is we're allowed 2 days to feel unhappy about the reviews, and then we have to be constructive and move on. So that's how we operate.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah. So what's going to happen in an ideal decision letter is the editor is going to lay out what's going to happen here. And there was a bullet point on the last screen saying the process is not a democracy. It sounds a bit harsh. I can still remember, like, one of my early reviews, I had a paper rejected, and I'll say what that means in a second. But I recall telling my advisor, like, I don't get it. 2 of the reviewers seemed pretty positive about it. And she said, that's right. The process is not a democracy. It's based on the editor's judgment and discretion. So the editor is not counting up the votes and deciding whether you get in. So the editor is making their own call. So I've seen the range of, I've seen papers that had all positive reviews get rejected. And I've also seen papers with a set of negative reviews have the editor invited back because that editor saw something in the paper they liked. So that's what we mean by the idea it's not a democracy. So it took, I didn't know that going in, and I'm now prepared for that, but That's something we thought you should know. So here are the outcomes. I'm giving you a set of 4. It turns out this really varies by journal. Like I've run into one journal that has 8 different outcomes, like different shades of reject and accept. I'll go with, I think, the core 4. So the first is outright rejection. And so that means the editor will indicate, thank you for submitting. There were significant concerns in the manuscript, and I will not be inviting, the manuscript will be rejected, and I will not be inviting a revision. So it's what it sounds like. You will not get another opportunity at that journal to resubmit an improved version of the manuscript. So that would be a reject. The other things that, to me, reject will happen, and then if you have a chance to come back, you're going to have some flavor of a major or minor revision, and some journals will let you know whether it's major or minor, and others, it's just up to you're going to have to make your own call on whether you think this is major or minor. So a major revision might include something like, this is interesting, but the reviewers identified a number of significant shortcomings in your data. We think you need to run additional studies. Or the theoretical framework we're using here doesn't really seem consistent. Here's theories X, Y, and Z. You should rewrite your paper considering those theories and frame it that way. So those are just examples. I don't think there's an exhaustive list I could give you, but those would be major elements: more data collection, rewrite the paper. A minor revision will often be, hey, could you clean up this analysis? Here's some literature you should integrate. I think your general discussion should be tighter. And to be honest, when I was a new student, I actually, when I was first doing this, I saw virtually anything they asked me as a major revision. The more I've done this, the more I can easily spot what's major versus minor. And so some journals, I can tell you, for some of the journals I've worked with, there is some code words. So if in the decision letter I say, I will send this back out to some or all of the same reviewers, that often implies a major revision. Sometimes the editors will say, I will try to make the decision on this. I may send it out. That's a little bit of code, but to be honest, there's no one rule of thumb that's going to apply to everybody on that. And then in the rare cases, I don't know if anybody else on the call has had this. I haven't had this experience.
No.
That we're just going to go. I don't know if this sounds like lore. Actually, Shannon's advisor was on a paper that was submitted to a major journal, and they had a note back from the editor in 2 hours saying, I love this paper, it's in. I don't know if you ever heard that story, Shannon, but yeah, so that's like
Wow.
that's the only instance I know of that ever happening. So the accept, it's okay. So it's okay if you don't get the accept as is. I've been doing this in the 90s, and I have yet to experience that.
At our journal, we do a desk reject that comes from me. And then we have another rejection where the associate editor might reject it, and so it's with or without review. So some papers, if it's a desk reject, I don't send it out for review. If it's one where I'm really on the fence, the associate editor will likely send it out, so it could be a reject with a review. And then we do major revisions. And there's often times where people will say major revisions, and you really get 2 shots at that. And if you're not making the paper significantly better to a conditional accept, then we will release the papers at that point. But we really don't want to be rejecting them. But usually, quickly with our journal, whether you're going to be moving on or not.
So from my perspective, the best decision letters, and you'll get a range. I've had decision letters which are see the reviews. You can resubmit, which isn't particularly helpful. To me, an ideal decision letter should be laying out the central themes, and it's not unusual. You also have to be ready for this. Reviewers will say things that are contradictory. So reviewer 1 will want this analysis. Reviewer 2 will tell you not to do that. And so to me, the goal of the action editor, the person making the decision, is to cut through that and to identify what are the key steps you need to take for this to be acceptable. So study that decision letter, study it really carefully. The editor will ideally essentially identify the path forward. So this is what you're going to attend to in your revision. But it's also common, and I myself am guilty of this, is all right, here's what I think the most important stuff is. And then I'll throw in, oh yeah, and you should attend to everything the reviewer said. So we'll talk about how you handle that situation. So my take on the world, and what I tell my grad students to do, is take the entire decision letter, copy the whole thing, and put it into Word, and then go into Word and go point by point through every single element of the decision letter, writing out how you would respond to that. And then, so what I do with my grad students is we do that, and then we trade that response among us. So we go back and forth till we decide we're happy with all of our responses. And then we use that set of responses as our roadmap to revise our manuscript. We've essentially said how we're going to handle every issue. And so we've made those decisions. All we need to do is follow our roadmap and implement that in the manuscript. And then you go back and do other things. So you go back and start identifying, and we'll talk about this in a bit, exactly like what page the changes are on and things like that. So take the decision letter, and it's okay, as I said, if you want to take a few days before you do that copying and pasting and responding, but go through each point. I can't emphasize enough. Go through every point. Don't ignore everything. You're going to actually get tired of hearing that because you're going to see that on the next screen. And Debbie, I don't know if you want to add how Saikai handles this.
Yeah, I totally agree with I hope everybody watches what you just said. That is the best way to handle it. We do give our authors a template, but our template's basically everything you just said. It's just to keep, especially for new authors, they're unaware that they have to respond to every single comment. Whether you liked it or you agreed or you didn't agree, you must respond to every comment. And just recently, we went around 3 times with an author, and we kept saying, you must address this. And they didn't. And so we're like, sorry, we can't take your paper. And it was a good paper, but you must address every comment. Everyone.
So we have a few tips we put together on how to write this. So I apologize, I'm sort of getting ahead of the game. The way it works is if you've been invited to resubmit, you're not only going to submit a revised manuscript, you're going to submit a response letter with it. And in fact, the instructions we gave you before about the idea of copying the letter, and that's not only your roadmap to revise, that's going to be your revision letter that you're going to turn back into the journal. So the journals will ask you to put a letter in. It'll typically say, describe how you address each of the points from the action letter. So a couple tips on doing that. So you want to be exceedingly polite, almost, I don't know, I talk about almost obsequious, like overly flattering to people. So for example, no matter what you think of the comment, you don't tell reviewers where they can stick that perspective. You would instead say, thank you so much for pointing that out. We think that was a great suggestion. So be very polite, exceedingly polite. As we said before, so I told you you're going to see this again, don't ignore any points made by reviewers and editors. I can tell you, it draws their ire if they're like, I clearly stated X and you pretended. The most common approach I've seen when people do that is they just pretend like that was never written and just don't put that in their response letter as though we're unaware of that. That is not, so again, in this process, you want to make friends, and that's really not a way to make friends. So don't ignore those. I really like it for the third bullet point where people are extremely clear, like I made this revision and you can find it here in the manuscript. So make it very easy for the editor to find that. Some journals, in fact, will go so far as to say, please identify all changes by, say, putting them in a red font. I've run into journals that want you to use Microsoft Word track changes and to show, I actually don't really enjoy reading track changes documents, but I've actually run into journals that force you to submit stuff with track changes. So in other words, journals want to know, we've asked you to change it, tell us where the change is, so be really clear on it. And then another thing that I want to push that one of my colleagues, Ben Clegg, is really good at is what he calls the humble rebuttal. So somebody said something you don't particularly care for, or they're basically saying, I don't get why you didn't discuss this literature, or why didn't you tell us about this aspect of your design? So your response, even if you're like, look, it's sitting there on page 20, that's not how you respond. You don't respond like, were you wearing your glasses, or are you having trouble here, or something like that. Instead, you respond with things like, we apologize for not being clear about our procedure. As indicated on page 20, people did X, Y, and Z. So so I love the humble rebuttal,
Yes.
where essentially you're saying, I get it. It was my fault. I should have been clear. In fact, by the way, what's hard, I don't know if you remember, I keep coming back to it. Kelly talked about the reviewer perspective. So it's very common because you're the one doing the manuscript. To you, everything is clear, all the connections are obvious, and it's hard for you to understand how other people couldn't make those connections. If reviewers are saying they don't understand it, it's because you weren't clear. You need to be clearer, and that's the way to take this kind of feedback right here. It's going to make the manuscript more accessible to everybody. You're going to have more impact, and people are going to be able to understand the message. And then in some cases, so what I will typically instruct authors is please respond to each element of the reviews, providing an explanation of how you change it or some kind of rebuttal. In cases where you really can't make the change, and I think Debbie can say more on this, it's okay not to make that change. You're just going to need to provide an explanation. I don't know, Debbie, if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, we get that sometimes where maybe like with analyses or something, it seems like they should be doing it a little bit different and we get a little pushback. But you know what? I'm totally willing to take pushback. You know, if someone says, we apologize for not being clear, but there just needs to be better communication. Sometimes I'll see it in mediation or moderation models, and maybe the reviewer didn't really fully understand it. And so we ask for more information, where to me, it might seem like there's an adequate amount, but to the reader, we need to make sure that it's very, very clear. So I leave those comments in. So, because if a reviewer is not really understanding it, and I always go with who's not understanding it and why. And so again, it's one of those things that when you can totally keep it the way it is, you just have to be clear about it. What are you doing and why? Citations are always good. You know, so if you say I'm following Judd and Kenny, cite them, you know, like this kind of thing, that goes over really well. And it shows us that you put effort into communicating to us.
So I really can't emphasize this enough. A good letter is disarming. I don't know how to put it. And I guess this is going to be recorded because I was about to say you can't hold me to. Honestly, if somebody writes a good letter, I go into the manuscript essentially saying like, yeah, they have this. I mean, I need to read the manuscript carefully, but they pretty much have this covered. So I just can't emphasize enough. A good letter relaxes everybody. You feel like you did what you needed to. A poor letter that's aggressive and essentially things which I've seen just gets everybody's radar up and frankly gets their ire up. And fair or not, you're essentially now inviting people to look for reasons why they don't think you did a particularly good revision. And frankly, if you're writing a poor letter, I think they're justified in saying this wasn't a particularly good revision. So it does so much for you having a good, thorough letter. It makes everybody feel like, yeah, she's got this. She handled all of these comments right here. And in fact, when I invite, this is nothing unique to me. When I invite a paper back, it's because I see a path forward, and I think this paper is going to be acceptable as long as you can address these points. So nobody's inviting you to do revisions because we enjoy you doing more work, so we can just go ahead and reject you in the next round or something like that. We're doing it because we think the outcome is going to be this paper is going to be acceptable if you can handle these comments. And this last one, I want to let Debbie talk about it. I think it's great about the degree to which we should be respectful.
Yeah, it's so important. Well, if I can, I'm going to go back to the very first point. And it's good social psychology here, folks. You're priming the people. When you write a good letter, you're priming me to feel better about you and what you're submitting. And it is key that it's respectful. I have had people write cover letters that just said, I'll be ready when you're ready to accept this. And it was like, wait a minute, we're pretty far from that. So it's really important to be respectful to the editors and realize reviewers are not getting paid generally. I mean, I don't know of any that get paid, and it takes a lot of time. So they're giving you a piece of their time to go over and give you really good feedback. Okay, mostly good feedback. But there's an occasional not so great, but it's mostly great feedback. So the key is when you write letters back, remember that. Remember it's your hard work, but it's also their hard work. So respect is a key.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're curious, I can tell you a really quick story on respect. In fact, I apologize if I turn red as I describe this. This is somewhat embarrassing. So when I was a relatively new professor, this is actually a paper with Shannon's advisor. So we submitted this paper, we got reviews back. They were pretty straightforward. We resubmitted to the journal. The action editor was a very well-known cognitive psychologist, great guy. For one of the tasks, we were asking people to write down as many of the 50 states as they could. And one of the reviewers was like, I don't understand why the number for your undergraduates is so low. I did the task and I got a lot more. And of course, to us, we're like, yeah, so you're saying this professor at some university remembered a little more than the 18-year-olds we tested. Like, is that so? Basically, we put in this kind of wiseacre comment. We were like, we find it unsurprising that this professor might have exceeded the freshmen and sophomores we tested. And we're not sure what to do with this. So again, we thought, I don't know, as not a particularly bright young professor, we thought maybe they would get a laugh from that. And the editor wrote me personally and said,
Oh,
looked at several times, and I just don't understand why you wrote that. I don't understand how you thought you were going to make friends with that comment. But I'm going to go ahead and ignore that, and I hope this can be a lesson for you. And again, I'm probably turning red right now talking about it, but I have kept that lesson faithfully since that time. And I am always hyper respectful. I'm glad I had somebody, by the way, who didn't decide that was actually grounds to go ahead and get rid of the paper, who sort of pulled me aside and said, yeah, this isn't how you operate. And so I was embarrassed by that, but it was a really important lesson. So this idea of respect, I definitely take to heart.
I think we all have a story similar to that.
Yeah.
At least you hear it early on. That's a nice part.
Mm-hmm.
Well, don't be surprised if you do get a rejection letter. All of us here have had that. And it just means that it wasn't a good fit or it needed some changes. But generally, rejection letters will give you some good advice. Even if it's just the editor, I try to like focus people on, okay, this is the reason. We often do reviews and then the rejections come in and you can see all the reviews. That's amazing feedback. And then you can work on your paper. And so it's a collaboration in the field of science that we all work together to make the very best work out there. And rejection is just part of it. And when we're young, we don't get a lot of rejection. We make up things so everybody gets a trophy. And then now you're in graduate school or you're a faculty or an undergraduate and you're trying to submit for publication and the rejection is a little bit stunning and shocking. But we always try to write our rejection letters in a way that we appreciate their work. It just might not be enough for our journal. So just look at it as just a learning lesson and everybody gets the lesson. You never publish. I don't know a single person at all that's ever been published that didn't get a rejection. So just know it's going to happen. So go into it with, it could or could not happen. If it does happen, I'll just revise, make changes, and resubmit somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Like, just it happens to everyone. Like, it feels personal, but everyone has gone through it, and so your colleagues, your professors will know what you're feeling. Just be open to seeking feedback, making changes, and just I like what Matt said about take 2 days to feel bad about it, but then keep going.
So by the way, on rejection, I would say in my own career, because I had a student once ask me, I think I've probably been rejected at least 2 to 4 times more frequently than I've ever had papers accepted. And I don't know if that makes me, I hope that doesn't make me unique, but yeah, so it's if you want to do this. But once a journal invites me back, I'm going to go ahead and apologize. It's not really that appropriate analogy, but I see myself almost in a battle of attrition with that journal. And once they invite me back, I'm going to keep coming back and coming back and coming back until they tell me to go away. So in my own literature, there's one paper. In fact, at this point, I'm not that keen on the paper that a friend of mine and I are actually known for. That paper got a heavy revise and resubmit, and the editor was asking for a better experiment. So we revised it and sent that experiment in. She said, that's not good enough. I need a better experiment. We did another experiment. We sent it in. That paper was rejected. We did another experiment. She didn't like that one. And finally, she was like, look, you have to prove X, or I'm just going to go ahead and reject this. So on the fourth time around, so I take a little bit to learn apparently, but on the fourth time around, this paper was accepted, and this is actually my most cited, well-known paper today. And that thing was a grind to get through, but we were not going to relent. We kept getting invited, and we kept coming back and coming back. And so that lesson there, keep plugging away. I just can't emphasize enough. You need to take that to heart. It's the nature of what we're all doing here. All of us go through that. Keep pushing forward. And again, I would also emphasize that last element. It's pretty rare that an editor would invite you to resubmit if they don't see the eventual outcome being a paper that's going to be acceptable. So keep plugging away at that, and you can come to that outcome of having that paper published.
Yeah, I think that's a really good note to end on, like a hopeful note. Like, it is stressful at times, and it takes a lot of perseverance, but everybody throughout the process really is just trying to make the science and the communication of the science the best it can be. So I guess we had one question in the chat that I'd like to read out loud. So one of the attendees asked, will we be able to get the PowerPoint and the audio recording? The audio recording will definitely be up on the SciChi website after everything is recorded. And I believe we should be able to put the PowerPoint up as well, along with that webinar recording. So I think with that, I would love to say thank you to everyone who attended, and thank you so much, Shannon, Matt, Debbie. I learned a lot, and I had a wonderful time working on this with you. So thank you very much. And I think with that, stay tuned for more webinars coming out from SciChi, and enjoy the rest of your night.
Happy writing, everyone.
Yeah, happy writing. All right.